Did Adolf Hitler actually derive inspiration from US policies towards Native Americans for the Holocaust? Let's understand this. We know what Adolf Hitler did. The Holocaust of, it is said, 6 million Jews, right? In various horrific death camps and whatnot. Auschwitz, Sobibor, Treblinka, and so on. Horrific chapter of history, not fun to talk about. So we'll not discuss it. But where did Adolf Hitler get the idea from? Where did he get the inspiration from? Did he get this inspiration of what he did to the Jews from US policies towards Native Americans? And that's the question Amisha is asking. Very interesting question. What is the truth? The truth is very interesting. So, Adolf Hitler was indeed someone who studied US policies, US racial policies towards the blacks and the Native Americans, and US expansionist policy. The US, how the US expanded relentlessly westwards from its initial base on the east coast of what is today the United States. And then it expanded relentlessly, inexorably westwards, grabbing and gobbling up more and more Native American territory, displacing the Native Americans, genociding them, massacring them if required, eventually taking the whole continent, essentially. Right? So Hitler, he studied this in detail. He looked upon what the Americans did as a model for what he should do in Europe. But it was not necessarily the single straightforward blueprint for the Holocaust that he committed. So, and how do we know this? See, Hitler wrote about this in Mein Kampf. Mein Kampf is this book that he wrote, My Struggle. Very unreadable book, actually. I tried more than 20 years ago. Pretty hard to read, but he wrote about this in Mein Kampf. And Hitler's writings speak about the fact that he regarded the United States as a racial state, as one of the most successful racial states on the world in the world, because of its successful immigration restrictions, because of the segregation system that the United States had at the time, and because of the conquest of the western continental frontier that the Americans successfully carried out. He was a huge fan of the United States. He was very pleased that a Nordic population, white skinned population, had displaced inferior brown skinned indigenous people and conquered their territory. And they had structured citizenship, they had structured immigration on the basis of racial lines, on the basis of so called white superiority. And Hitler said that this is a great model, it sets a great precedent for what his goals were in Europe, especially Eastern Europe. The German, the Nazi desire for a Lebensraum in Eastern Europe, to conquer Eastern European territories and settle Germans there. And what should be done with the people who lived there? Deal with them the way the Americans dealt with the Native Americans. Yeah. So the Nazis, not just Hitler, but the Nazis, they studied all of this. They studied American laws, anti-miscegenation laws, the Jim Crow, the segregation laws and policies, etc. The Jim Crow rules or laws the Americans had. They studied the citizenship and immigration laws or rules that favored white Europeans and excluded non-whites. They examined laws that dealt with the Indian problem, the Native American problem, reservation policies, and how to treat the natives and the native nations, to treat them as people who are under your jurisdiction, under your subjugation, who are not sovereign. Don't treat them as sovereign peoples. Treat them as wards. Right? So Hitler studied all of this, and they saw the American conquest of America as the precedent for the Nazi desire for a Lebensraum in Eastern Europe. So, and you can see that the way the Americans dehumanized the Native Americans, the way they forcibly removed them, the way they forcibly removed them from their territory, the way the Americans used hunger as a weapon against the Native Americans. All of this, the Germans would eventually replicate when it comes to the people they whose territories they conquered and the people they subjugated. So you can see that there are a lot of the Nazi actions where you could say influenced by American actions in the 18th and 19th centuries, even 20th century, in a variety of ways, right? So they consciously used aspects of US policy, of US race law as models and as justification for what they did. So Hitler was a huge fan of the United States, right? He looked up to the United States. Um, so that was the deal. But when it comes to the Holocaust, the genocide of the Jews that the Germans, that the Nazis committed, you could say it's not just based on what the Americans did to the native populations of North America. It was also based on anti-Semitism, which in Europe there's a 2,000-year-old history of anti-Semitism. So it was also based on that, not just based on what the Americans did. It was also based on various German colonial practices. It was based on the experiences the Germans had in the First World War. It was based on Nazi ideology, also racial superiority, the Übermensch, that sort of thing. So all these different influences came together, including the very important model that they copied from the US. And that gave rise to, well, the displacement of people in Eastern Europe, the concentration camps that the Nazis set up, the systematic genocide of the Jewish people, all of that. So the US policies towards Native Americans are one strand of influence in um, in the way the Nazis behaved. It's not the only thing, but it was definitely a major and very important influence on the Nazis, on Hitler's policies and behavior and actions.